Imagine being so, you know, emotionally intelligent, so deeply empathetic and understanding of everyone around you that you know exactly how to perfectly, almost invisibly control them.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right. Like you know their fears, you know their daily habits, what they value most. And instead of using that understanding to set them free, you use it to build a cage so comfortable they don't even realize they're locked inside.
It is a genuinely terrifying thought because, well, we almost always equate empathy and understanding with benevolence, right? We
Exactly.
just assume that if someone truly gets us, they must have our best interests at heart. But when you scale that kind of acute reflective understanding up to the level of geopolitics, it becomes something else entirely.
It becomes a machine that mistakes careful control for moral goodness. And that chilling concept is exactly where we're starting today. Welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're exploring one of history's most massive, complex, and enduring human systems. I mean, we're talking about the Ottoman Empire.
Right, specifically looking at its sprawling dominance from roughly 1500 to 1900.
But we aren't just going to read you a dry timeline of battles and treaties, you know. The sources we're working from today are incredibly unique.
Oh, absolutely.
We have this set of highly philosophical research notes that examine the Ottoman Empire through the lens of a specific psychological profile. The notes actually call this profile a subpersonality named Tira.
Which is such a brilliant, unorthodox way to analyze a state, because usually when we study empires, we look at them as, pure administrative or military juggernauts.
Right.
But the Ottoman Empire wasn't a colonial empire in the overseas distant settlement mold of, say, the British or the Spanish.
How so?
Well, the British Empire was defined by distance, right?
Mm-hmm.
You had the metropole in London sending ships across oceans to extract wealth from places they considered entirely other.
Okay, yeah.
But the Ottoman Empire was this contiguous, land-connected, world-shaping power. At its height, it was the central engine of Afro-Eurasian politics, war, trade, and cultural exchange. You didn't sail away to the Ottoman Empire. You lived inside its immense, sprawling borders.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I'm sure you're wondering, why are we looking at an empire through a psychological profile? And why should you, the person listening to this right now on your computer while doing the dishes, actually care?
That's the big question.
Right, because this is really a story about what happens when you take a deeply reflective, patient, and complex personality, this Tira persona, and you scale it up to the size of a global empire.
Yeah.
It's an exploration of how the ability to organize human difference at a massive scale is almost inevitably, inextricably linked to the ability to wound at scale. It kind of forces us to look at the massive systems in our own lives today and ask, are they managing us or are they suffocating us?
Right. And to even begin to understand how that tension operated, we can't really start with the psychology. We actually have to start with the dirt.
The dirt.
Yeah. The physical reality of the empire. Geography.
Yeah.
Because geography dictates survival, and it dictates the kind of state you're forced to become. So the Ottoman core originated in northwestern Anatolia around the turn of the 14th century. It started as a relatively small frontier principality.
Just a small group, really.
Exactly. But it expanded outward in every direction to encompass the Balkans and Europe, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Arab lands of the Middle East, Egypt, and sweeping across much of North Africa.
Wow.
And then, after the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, which they transformed into Istanbul, they firmly established their imperial center.
And when you look at a map of that footprint, they aren't just holding vast tracts of empty land, right? They're holding the global intersections, the absolute, undeniable choke points of the known world.
Oh, entirely. They possessed a geopolitical real estate portfolio that is almost unimaginable today. I mean, they controlled physical choke points like the Bosporus and the Dardanelles Straits.
So if you wanted to move a ship,
If you wanted to move a ship from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, you passed under Ottoman guns and paid Ottoman tolls. There was no way around it.
that's incredible leverage.
It was.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just physical straits. They also controlled what we might call conceptual choke points.
Conceptual choke points. Explain that.
So think about the great caravan routes, right? Like the Silk Road terminuses, or the massive religious pilgrimage routes.
Oh, like the Hajj.
Exactly. Every year, tens of thousands of Muslims from across the globe traveled to Mecca and Medina. The Ottomans controlled those holy cities and all the routes leading to them.
Wow.
So they managed the flow of global trade, the flow of religious devotion, and the flow of information linking Europe, Asia, and Africa. They weren't just a land empire, they were a connector empire. They were essentially the world's grand central station.
But I mean, the sheer ecological and human diversity of that space is staggering. You have the freezing, rugged mountains of the Balkans. You have the high, arid Anatolian plateaus.
Yeah.
Then you have the incredibly fertile river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, the cosmopolitan coasts along the Mediterranean, and the agricultural powerhouse of the Nile in Egypt. How do you actually run that?
It's a huge challenge.
Right, because you can't just issue one law in Istanbul and expect it to work for a nomadic herdsman in Anatolia and a wealthy maritime merchant in Greece.
What's fascinating here is that this specific geography demanded a very specific type of governance.
Okay.
If you try to rule that kind of diversity with rigid, top-down, despotic chaos, if you try to force everyone to be exactly the same, the empire shatters in a generation.
It just wouldn't hold.
Not at all. You need incredible logistical flexibility. The Ottomans were defined by a concept the source material calls imperial pragmatism.
I want to dig into that mechanism. What does imperial pragmatism actually look like on the ground? Because when I think of imperial expansion, I think of bulldozers,
Right, the typical conqueror narrative.
Yeah, I think of an invading army burning down the local government house, outlawing the local language, and forcing everyone to worship the new king.
And that is exactly what the Ottomans generally avoided doing because it is incredibly expensive and, frankly, inefficient.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, imperial pragmatism meant that they governed through a deeply layered, highly adaptable system. When they conquered a new territory, say a province in the Balkans or a region in the Levant, they didn't automatically destroy the local structure.
They didn't.
No, they absorbed them. I mean, they sent a governor from Istanbul, sure, and a judge to oversee the courts. But the local notables, the people who actually knew how the local harvest worked and who owned what land, they were often kept in place.
Okay, I see.
The Ottomans supervised them and, most importantly, they taxed them.
I have an analogy for this, and I want to see if it holds up historically. It makes me think of how massive corporate acquisitions work today in the tech sector.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's say a giant trillion-dollar tech conglomerate buys a brilliant, nimble little startup that makes a highly specific piece of software.
Right.
The absolute worst move the parent company could make is to fire all the startup's engineers, delete their custom software, and force everyone to use the giant company's clunky legacy code. The startup would just die. The smartest move, the pragmatist move, is to walk into the startup's office and say, hey, keep doing exactly what you're doing, keep your daily operations the same. Just make sure the revenue flows upward to our corporate accounts and put our logo on your website.
That is a highly accurate parallel. The Ottomans were the ultimate masters of administrative acquisition.
Oh.
Why spend imperial gold trying to teach a newly conquered Hungarian farming community a totally new way of agricultural management?
Right. They already know how to farm there.
Exactly. Let them farm the way they have for centuries. Just institute a local tax farmer who ensures a portion of that grain, or its value in silver, makes its way to the provincial treasury, which then, of course, funds the imperial military machine.
It's ruthlessly efficient.
It really is. Power rested on a blend of overwhelming military force when necessary, combined with law, religious legitimacy, and highly negotiated local hierarchies.
But to run an empire this vast, this layered, and this intensely pragmatic over centuries, you can't just be lucky. It requires a very specific psychological worldview at the top.
It does.
Which brings us directly to the fascinating lens of our source material, the Tira framework.
Right. So according to the research notes we're analyzing, Tira is a psychological subpersonality marked by a very distinct set of traits.
What kind of traits?
Well, she's defined by wisdom, deep patience, reflection, emotional discernment, and a profound tendency to live in thresholds rather than absolutes.
Threshold, okay.
Yeah, the notes describe her as a witness and weaver. She is someone who holds paradox gently. She operates through quiet influence, observation, and structural design rather than loud, immediate, brute spectacle.
And the parallels between this psychological persona and the Ottoman state itself are just striking. I mean, the empire was a literal bridge civilization, just as Tira is framed as a bridge between worlds, between logic and feeling.
Absolutely.
The Ottomans sat squarely between Europe and Asia. They had to balance their deep Islamic legitimacy with ruthless, secular imperial pragmatism.
And balance a plurality of languages and faiths.
Right. With a strict, unyielding hierarchy, they existed entirely in a threshold space.
And their power, much like Tira's, didn't come merely from swinging a bigger sword. The source describes Tira's strength as the wisdom onion.
The wisdom onion.
Yeah, it's a deeply layered form of power derived through careful structure, discernment, and immense depth. Yes, the Ottoman Empire was formidable militarily, but its true durability, the reason it survived for over 600 years, came from its systems.
The layers of the onion.
Exactly. Its intricate tax collection protocols, its provincial administration, its legal pluralism, and its massive networks of charitable endowments, called MOATs, that funded hospitals, schools, and soup kitchens. They organized diversity without fully dissolving it.
I'm looking at these notes, and I have a real problem with the word wisdom here.
Oh.
Yeah, because our source material asks a very dark, very profound philosophical question. What happens when those exact traits, Tira's patience, her reflection, her empathy scale, up into a massive imperial machine?
That is the big question.
And I want to push back on the very concept of empathy or understanding equating to goodness. If you are a ruler and you are incredibly emotionally discerning, if you truly, deeply understand how different communities think, what they fear, and what they value, you've just built the perfect blueprint to manipulate them.
You are hitting on the central thesis of the notes, the corruptions of scale. When you apply deeply human, seemingly positive traits to an empire of millions of people, the meaning of those traits mutates. The source material outlines this beautifully and tragically. Tira's patience, which is a virtue in a single human being, scales up and becomes an overtoleration of rigid hierarchy and systemic suffering.
Wow.
And her reflective distance becomes a cold, chilling imperial detachment. If a famine strikes a distant province, reflective distance means you calmly calculate the tax loss rather than rushing to feed the starving.
And her gift for holding contradictions, that becomes a system that simply normalizes unequal coexistence instead of actually healing the inequality.
Precisely.
The source explicitly says that her ability to understand others makes her extraordinarily effective at ruling them without ever actually freeing them.
Yeah, the empire presented its rule as ordered, legitimate, naturally ordained, and universal. But under large-scale power, wisdom just becomes administration.
It becomes paperwork.
It becomes paperwork, demographics, and logistics. And administration, no matter how elegant or understanding it appears, is fundamentally a tool to dominate.
So if the empire is, as the text brilliantly phrases it, mistaking careful control for moral goodness, I want to know what that actually looked like on the ground.
Let's look at it.
You have millions of people. You have Muslims, Christians, Jews, different ethnicities, different languages. How did this over-toleration of hierarchy and this careful control function in the daily lives of the subjects?
It functioned through an incredibly intricate mechanism of what the text calls ranked coexistence. But first, we have to understand the foundational worldview of the state. The Ottoman Empire was profoundly shaped by Sunni Islam. Eventually, the Ottoman sultans claimed the title of caliph, which is a crucial mechanism to understand.
Let's pause there. What does it actually mean to claim the title of caliph? Why did they do it? And how did it help them manage this massive machine?
Well, the caliph is historically the political and religious successor to the Prophet Muhammad, the leader of the entire global Sunni Muslim community.
Okay.
So when the Ottomans conquered Egypt in 1517, they defeated the Mamluks and took custody of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Claiming the caliphate gave the Ottoman Sultan immense transcendent religious prestige.
It elevates him above just being a king.
Exactly. It meant he wasn't just a king who won battles. He was the shadow of God on earth. It provided an ultimate layer of legitimacy that made rebelling against him not just treason, but a sin.
But here's the paradox. They are the leaders of the global Islamic community, but they are governing massive, in some regions, majority Christian and Jewish populations. Like, the Balkans were heavily Orthodox Christian. Cities like Salonika had massive Jewish populations, especially after the Ottomans welcomed Jewish refugees fleeing the Spanish Inquisition in 1492. How do you govern them under an Islamic framework?
You utilize a mechanism that came to be known as the millet system.
Break that down for me. How did the millet system work mechanically?
A millet was essentially a legally protected religious community. The Ottomans recognized the Greek Orthodox, the Armenian Christians, and the Jewish communities as distinct entities.
Okay.
They allowed these communities to maintain their own religious institutions, their own leadership, like the Greek Orthodox Patriarch in Istanbul, and crucially, their own internal courts to handle family law, marriage, divorce, and inheritance according to their own religious traditions.
Please stop right there. You're saying they had their own courts? That sounds incredibly tolerant, almost like a modern multicultural democracy.
It does sound that way on the surface.
But what happens when the lines cross? Let's say a Greek Orthodox merchant and a Muslim tradesman get into a contract dispute over a shipment of silk in the market. Or what if a Christian and a Muslim get into a physical altercation? Whose law wins? They
Yeah.
can't both use their own courts.
And that is exactly where the concept of ranked coexistence reveals its teeth. It was pluralistic, but it was absolutely not equal in the modern democratic sense.
Right.
In any dispute involving a Muslim and a non-Muslim, the case had to be heard in the Islamic courts before a Muslim judge, a qadi. And in those courts, the legal testimony of a non-Muslim was generally not afforded the same weight as that of a Muslim.
Wow. Okay.
Furthermore, non-Muslim communities had to pay a specific poll tax, the sizzi, which was both a source of revenue for the state and a symbol of their subordinate status. They had restrictions on building new places of worship, on riding horses, sometimes even on what others they could wear.
Ranked coexistence, meaning you are tolerated, you are allowed to practice your faith, you are physically protected by the state armies, but you are firmly legally subordinated.
It's exactly protection and subordination.
Happening at the exact same time, in the exact same legal breath. That is Tira's wisdom onion in action. It's a cage, but it's a cage that lets you keep your traditions so you are less likely to violently rebel against it.
Spot on. And this meant daily life varied enormously depending on who you were, what your religion was, and where you lived. We tend to talk about history in sweeping generalizations, but let's ground this. Let's imagine a Tuesday in the year 1550.
Okay, paint the picture for me.
So if you're an Arab Muslim farmer in rural Syria on that Tuesday, the empire is distant. Your reality is dictated by the seasons, the local landowner, and the imperial tax collector who arrives to take a cut of your grain.
Very disconnected from the capital.
Right. Now, if you are a Jewish scholar living in the port city of Salonika, your Tuesday is defined by the bustling maritime trade, studying in the yeshiva, and navigating the internal politics of your millet. But if you are a Greek Orthodox merchant living in the cosmopolitan hub of Galata, right across the water from the imperial palace in Istanbul, your Tuesday is a masterclass in navigating overlapping worlds. You are trading with Venetian Catholics, paying taxes to Ottoman Muslim officials, and socializing with Armenian craftsmen.
But for all of them, the empire wasn't experienced as this grand, sweeping geopolitical glory. It wasn't the Sultan riding on a white horse.
No, not at all.
The empire was experienced as the local courts. It was the neighborhood guilds that regulated the price of bread and shoes. It was marriages, local customs, and the sudden, terrifying intrusion when the empire declared war and requisitioned your pack animals, or when a new tax was decreed.
It was lived in the subtle, everyday realities. And our sources highlight some incredibly important nuances here regarding the social fabric, specifically the role of women.
Oh, this is fascinating.
It is so easy to fall into simplistic Orientalist stereotypes about gender roles in historical Islamic empires, assuming women were entirely invisible, locked away in harems with absolute powerlessness.
Right, the classic Hollywood depiction.
Which is deeply inaccurate. The notes emphasize that while gender roles were strictly structured and undeniably unequal, women exercised immense real agency.
How so?
They didn't usually hold formal bureaucratic office, but they operated powerfully through the courts. Ottoman court records show women constantly suing for their property rights, demanding divorces, and managing complex business transactions.
Really?
Yeah. Wealthy women established massive charitable endowments, building mosques, fountains, and hospitals, which was a deeply political act of public influence. They operated through households and local economies.
It's all about finding the leverage points within the structure you're confined to. And speaking of the social fabric, there is one detail in the source notes that I absolutely love because I think it perfectly captures this Ottoman blend of connection, culture, and subtle, pervasive control. Coffee.
Ah, yes. The great Ottoman contribution to global insomnia.
Right. The spread of coffee culture. Coffee originally comes from Yemen, and it spreads throughout the Ottoman world in the 16th century. And suddenly, you have the rise of a brand new institution, the coffee house.
Yeah, a total game changer.
And these become the ultimate threshold spaces. Men from different classes, scholars, merchants, off-duty soldiers, gather there. They aren't in the mosque, and they aren't at home.
No, it's neutral ground.
Exactly. They are in a new public sphere to drink coffee, talk, debate poetry, play backgammon, and listen to stories. It's a space for incredible connection, intellectual cross-pollination, and even subtle political dissent. But it was also a space for surveillance.
It's the physical architectural manifestation of the Tira framework, a place that looks like pure community, but operates as a node of observation.
I cannot emphasize enough how much this sounds exactly like modern social media platforms. Think about
Well,
it.
it's a great point.
You log onto a platform today, and the stated goal, the marketing pitch, is pure connection. Share your photos, debate ideas, tell stories, build communities with people across the globe.
But the reality is different.
Right, because the foundational architecture of the platform, the very reason it exists, is built on surveillance. It is tracking your data, monitoring your network, managing the flow of information, and selling that behavioral data. The connection and the control are growing in the exact same soil. You can't have one without the other. The Ottoman coffee house was the algorithm of the 16th century street.
That is a phenomenal comparison. But we need to look at the historical mechanism of how that surveillance actually worked. It wasn't just a vague sense of being watched.
How do they do it?
Well, the Ottoman state was acutely aware that where men gathered to talk, sedition could brew faster than the coffee. So how did they monitor it? They didn't usually send in uniformed guards to stand in the corner that would ruin the atmosphere. They relied on a network of informants.
Spies.
Exactly. Sometimes paid informants, sometimes guild members who were leaned on by the authorities, sometimes the coffee house owner himself, who knew his license to operate depended on keeping the local magistrate informed of any radical talk.
Okay.
The state paid people to listen to the gossip. If a group of janissaries were grumbling about their pay in a coffee house in the capital, the Grand Vizier knew about it by nightfall. The state used the human desire for connection to monitor the pulse of the public.
To build and maintain a society of ranked coexistence, to manage these vast systems of tax farming, military logistics, and cultural surveillance, you need very specific kinds of leaders.
Yeah.
You don't need pure fairy tale heroes or mustache-twirling villains. You need people who understand the machinery.
Yes.
You need what the philosophical notes call agents of structure.
And we must look at these historical figures through that exact lens. The source material urges us to view them not just as isolated characters making free choices, but as currents in a river.
That's poetic.
It is. Some currents nourish the land by bringing silt and water, some erode the banks and cause floods, and most do both at exactly the same time.
Let's trace that river. We have to start with Osman I, who ruled right around the turn of the 14th century. The empire literally takes its name from him, the Ottoman Empire, the Empire of Osman. But when he was alive, he wasn't ruling a vast multi-continental machine, was he?
Not at all. He was essentially a frontier warlord, a leader of a nomadic Turkic group, carving out space in a highly fragmented Anatolian world right on the crumbling edge of the old Byzantine Empire.
So how did he become so legendary?
His historical importance isn't about the sheer scale of his territory, it's about the trajectory he set. He set the initial pattern of expansion, of drawing diverse warriors to his banner through the promise of booty and holy war, Gaza.
He built the foundation.
Exactly. He built legitimacy through both force and narrative. He's remembered almost mythically as a beginning, a seed, rather than a fully documented bureaucratic leader.
But then the seed grows, and you jump forward a century and a half to a figure who absolutely changes the world. Mehmed II, the Conqueror.
Yes, massive figure.
The year is 1453. He captures Constantinople, the impregnable capital of the Byzantine Empire, and transforms it into Istanbul.
This raises an important question about historical memory and the nature of these agents of structure. Mehmed II's capture of Constantinople is one of those rare, undeniable hinge points in world history.
It really is.
He utilized massive siege cannons, which was a feat of modern logistics and engineering, to breach walls that had stood for 1,000 years. He repositioned the empire from a powerful regional state to a global center sitting directly between continents.
But look at how he is remembered, depending on where you're standing. In the Ottoman and Turkish narrative, he is a visionary, a brilliant scholar warrior, a world historical leader who opened a new age.
Right.
But in the European, particularly the Greek Orthodox memory, he is a formidable, terrifying conqueror.
Yeah.
He represents an existential threat, the man who brought down the last vestige of the Roman Empire.
And both narratives are responding to the same structural actions. Once he conquered the city, he didn't just burn it to the ground, he immediately set about rebuilding it.
By doing what?
He repopulated it by forcibly relocating merchants and artisans from across his domains. He preserved the seat of the Orthodox Patriarch because he needed the Christian population to run the economy. He built institutions, sponsored arts, and enabled cultural flourishing.
But all of that was built on conquest.
Exactly. He did so through the initial act of brutal conquest and forced demographic engineering. He is a hero to one narrative and a villain to another, which proves the source's point perfectly. These figures are not pure chaos, they are order with massive generational consequences.
To really understand how they built order, we have to talk about the mechanism that fueled this entire era of expansion. We cannot talk about the Ottomans without talking about the Janissaries, and more specifically, the system that created them, the dissolution.
The dissolution is perhaps the most striking, controversial, and brilliant mechanism of imperial pragmatism and control in the entire Ottoman toolkit.
Explain how it worked, because from a modern perspective, it sounds absolutely horrifying.
It was a system of forced recruitment, sometimes called the blood tax. Every few years, Ottoman officials would go into the Christian provinces, primarily in the Balkans, and they would requisition a certain number of young, healthy Christian boys, usually between the ages of 8 and 18.
Just take them.
Just take them. These boys were taken from their families, brought to the imperial center, converted to Islam, and put through an incredibly rigorous multi-year system of physical, intellectual, and military training.
They kidnapped children. Let's be clear about the human reality of this. They systematically took children from their parents.
Yes, they did.
Why? Why go through all that trouble when they had millions of Turkish Muslim subjects they could have recruited for the army?
To understand why, you have to look at the structural vulnerability of early empires. If a sultan relies entirely on the established Turkish nobility for his army and his administration, those nobles get too powerful.
They become a threat.
Exactly. They build their own power bases, they challenge the sultan. The dissolution was a ruthless, brilliant solution to this structural problem.
By creating a blank slate.
Right. By taking these boys, cutting them off from their biological families, their homelands, and their original religion, the state created a new class of elite soldiers and administrators whose entire existence, wealth, and loyalty were tied exclusively to the sultan.
They were technically enslaved to the sultan,
Right.
But they weren't laboring in field.
Exactly. They were legally the slaves of the gate, but it was an elite, highly privileged form of servitude. The strongest and most militarily gifted became the Janissaries, the most feared, disciplined, and technologically advanced infantry in Europe, the first standing army to widely use firearms.
And the ones who weren't soldiers?
The most intellectually gifted boys were sent to the palace schools. They became the scribes, the provincial governors, and frequently the grand viziers, the second most powerful men in the empire.
This is the ultimate example of the Tira framework's dark side. The empire is organizing difference-taking boys from the periphery, educating them, placing them in a pure meritocracy where a peasant boy from Serbia could become the Grand Vizier. That sounds amazing on paper.
On paper, sure.
But the mechanism of that organization is wounding at scale. It is built on the profound trauma of tearing families apart. It is administrative genius born of absolute cruelty.
It is the ultimate expression of prioritizing the structure of the state over the humanity of the individual. And this system reached its absolute zenith under the figure who represents the peak of imperial confidence, Suleiman the Magnificent.
He rules in the 16th century. He is expanding the territory deep into Europe, laying siege to Vienna, pushing into the Middle East. But he's just a conqueror. In the Islamic world, he is known as Kanuni, the lawgiver.
Yes, because while the empire operated on Islamic law Sharia, there were vast areas of administration, taxation, and criminal law that Sharia didn't explicitly cover.
So he filled in the gaps.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Suleiman harmonized the secular imperial decrees, the Qanun, with Islamic law, creating a standardized, predictable legal framework across the vast territories. He is the ultimate system builder, perfectly balancing the sword of the Janissaries with the structure of the courts.
But the figure from this era that absolutely fascinates me, the one who feels like the absolute purest embodiment of the Tira subpersonality in our notes, isn't Suleiman. It's Hürrem Sultan.
Ah, yes. Hürrem Sultan is a vital inclusion in these philosophical notes. Her story is extraordinary.
Tell us about her.
She was born in what is now Ukraine, captured by Tatar raiders as a young girl, sold into slavery, and brought to the imperial harem in Istanbul. Yet she rose to become Suleiman's legal wife, breaking centuries of Ottoman tradition, and an incredibly influential political actor.
That's unheard of at the time.
Completely. She completely reshaped palace politics, creating what historians call the Sultanate of women, an era where royal women wielded immense state power.
History, especially popular history, is so often obsessed with the conquerors, right? The men with the swords, riding the horses, pointing at maps. But Hürrem Sultan represents a completely different vector of power. Well, the source material says she represents power that operates quietly, relationally, structurally, rather than openly. She reveals that true influence doesn't always have to look like a direct command shouted on a battlefield.
Exactly. Her power was entirely positional. The harem wasn't just a place of domestic concubinage, it was the inner sanctum of the imperial household, the ultimate nexus of access to the Sultan.
And she leveraged that.
She leveraged that access brilliantly. She acted as Suleiman's chief advisor. She managed correspondence with foreign leaders, like the King of Poland. She oversaw massive charitable building projects in Jerusalem, Mecca, and Istanbul, which, as we discussed, was a primary way to project political legitimacy and secure public favor.
She is a masterclass in relational power. She's sometimes romanticized in television shows and sometimes vilified in historical accounts as manipulative or scheming. But both of those views totally miss the point.
They do.
She was an agent of structure. She navigated an imperial system designed explicitly to exploit her as property, and through intelligence, patience, and emotional discernment, the very traits of Tira, she ended up steering the empire.
That relational, structural power becomes even more apparent and desperate when you look at the later figures, the reformers.
Right, because things start to break down.
Eventually, the mighty systems built by Mehmed and Suleiman began to calcify. The world changed, and the Ottoman machine started to fall behind. You have figures like Selim III in the late 18th century.
What did he try to do?
He was a ruler who clearly saw the empire falling behind European competition, both militarily and economically. He attempted to build a new order army, bypassing the Janissaries, and tried to modernize the administration. But he was overthrown and eventually killed by conservative forces, including the Janissaries.
He understood the problem. He had the vision. But he lacked the sheer, ruthless force to push the pragmatism through the entrenched systems. The machine rebelled against the mechanic.
Exactly. Which brings us to Mahmud II in the early 19th century. Mahmud II learned from Selim's failure. He recognized that the old structures were not just calcifying, they were actively strangling the state. So in 1826, he executed a maneuver known as the Auspicious Incident.
Which is an incredibly polite name for a massacre.
It really is. The Janissaries, who had once been the elite vanguard of the empire, had devolved over centuries into a corrupt, hereditary, conservative mafia that controlled Istanbul and vetoed any modernization.
So what did he do?
Mahmud II secretly built the modern artillery corps loyal only to him. He provoked the Janissaries into a rebellion, and then he ordered his new artillery to simply obliterate their barracks.
Oh, wow.
Thousands were killed. The institution was entirely wiped out in a day. He centralized power and pushed modernization forcefully. The historical memory of him is that he was absolutely necessary but incredibly harsh. He achieved reform, but he had to do it through violent rupture.
Because these leaders weren't operating in a vacuum, as the source notes say. They made decisions constrained by survival, geopolitical competition, and the desperate need for legitimacy. And those decisions, whether they were Suleiman's laws or Mahmud's canons, affected millions of people who had absolutely no say in the matter.
Right.
They scaled power, and in doing so, they scaled both creation and harm.
And that constraint of survival wasn't just an internal struggle against rebellious soldiers or corrupt tax collectors. It was largely external. This concept of relational power that you highlighted with Hürrem's Sultan, it defined the entire empire's geopolitical strategy.
They didn't exist in a bubble.
Not at all. The Ottoman Empire did not exist in isolation. It existed in a fiercely competitive, unforgiving global web.
Because of that geography we talked about in the beginning, sitting at the intersection of Europe, Asia, and Africa meant they didn't have to build massive fleets to sail across the ocean to discover the world. The world was constantly, relentlessly passing through their living room.
The notes emphasize that the Ottomans possessed incredible relational intelligence on a global scale. They interacted with the world not just through war, but through complex, highly negotiated trade. Silk from Persia, spices from the Indian Ocean, textiles, grain.
They were the middlemen of the world.
They needed the outside world to remain themselves. They needed rivals to define their borders and justify their military ethos. They needed allies to balance overwhelming threats. And they needed trade partners to sustain the massive cash flow required to run their bureaucracy.
This relational intelligence leads to some really surprising alliances that shatter our modern assumptions.
Oh, absolutely.
When I think of this era, the 1500s and 1600s, I usually think of strict, uncompromising religious warfare. Christians versus Muslims, crusades and jihads. But the Ottoman Empire formed a major, enduring alliance with France.
Yes, the Franco-Ottoman alliance, initiated between King Francis I of France and Suleiman the Magnificent. It was a geopolitical earthquake. It is a perfect example of imperial pragmatism superseding religious dogma.
Why did they do it? What was the mechanism behind a Christian king allying with the Islamic caliph?
The Habsburg monarchy. The Habsburgs, based in Austria and Spain, were the dominant superpower in Europe, and they were squeezing France from both sides. Francis was desperate.
And the Ottomans.
The Ottomans, meanwhile, were pushing into Eastern Europe and saw the Habsburgs as their primary continental rival. So they allied. A Christian-Muslim alliance in a deeply, fiercely religious era.
Unbelievable.
France got military support and incredible trading privileges, the capitulations, and the Ottomans got a powerful ally to distract the Habsburgs on their western flank. It proves that when the survival of the state is at stake, ideology bends. Pure power overrides strict religious doctrine.
It makes me think of an ecological system. The Ottoman Empire wasn't an isolated apex predator living alone on an island. It was a keystone species in a massive, interconnected biological web.
That's a great way to look at it.
If a rival pack of wolves, like the Habsburgs, was getting too strong on one border, the Ottomans wouldn't just fight them in a mindless war of attrition. They would form a symbiotic relationship with an unexpected partner like the French to flank them. They managed the ecosystem, balancing the predators and the prey.
And they had formidable rivals pushing back from every side, testing that ecosystem constantly. In Europe, the Habsburg monarchy was a constant grinding border pressure over centuries.
Which led to Vienna, right?
Yes, culminating in major existential conflicts like the Siege of Vienna in 1683, which ultimately failed and halted Ottoman expansion into Central Europe forever. And then to the east, they face an entirely different kind of threat, the Safavid Empire in Persia.
The Safavids. This is where the Sunni-Shia divide becomes a major geopolitical fault line, right?
Exactly. The Ottomans were the champions of Sunni Islam, and the Safavids established Twelver Shia Islam as the state religion of Persia. They fought a series of brutal, exhausting wars over control of Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, and eastern Anatolia.
Like Chaldiran.
Right. The Battle of Chaldiran in 1514 is a prime example, where Ottoman artillery devastated the Safavid cavalry. Religion mattered deeply here. It was the ideological fuel. But the wars were ultimately about territory, control of the Silk routes, and regional supremacy. Those conflicts quite literally helped define the modern Sunni-Shia geopolitical boundaries in the Middle East today.
And then you had the maritime rivals. The Venetian Republic and the Spanish Empire, battling the Ottomans for naval dominance and control of the incredibly lucrative Mediterranean trade routes.
Which leads to massive clashes like the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. A Holy League coalition of European powers inflicted a catastrophic naval defeat on the Ottoman fleet. They destroyed almost the entire navy. In Europe, it was celebrated as a miraculous, tide-turning victory.
But the source notes point out something crucial about Lepanto that highlights the resilience of the Ottoman machine. A massive defeat didn't mean total collapse, it just meant recalibration.
The Ottoman response to Lepanto is legendary. The Grand Vizier famously told the Venetian ambassador, "In wresting Cyprus from you, we deprived you of an arm. In defeating our fleet, you have only shaved our beard. An arm when cut off cannot grow again, but a shorn beard will grow all the better."
That is such a flex.
And he was right. The sheer economic and logistical capacity of the empire allowed them to rebuild an entirely new, massive fleet in a single winter. Returning to the Tira framework, that is the essence of existing in tension rather than certainty. The empire read its environment, it absorbed the blow, marshaled its resources, and adapted.
But what happens when the global ecosystem around you starts evolving faster than you can adapt? What happens when your wisdom onion of careful, slow structure, your reliance on ancient agricultural taxes and layered local administration becomes a massive liability?
You enter the period of the long frame. And we need to be very clear here. The fall of the Ottoman Empire was not a sudden, dramatic collapse. It wasn't a tower falling over in a single night.
It was a slow process.
Very slow. The source material describes it beautifully and tragically. It was a slow unraveling, a fabric slowly thinning.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because how does an empire that lasted for 600 years, an empire that survived crusades, plagues, and massive internal rebellions, just thin out? What were the actual mechanisms of its decline?
It comes down to a fatal mismatch between its internal operating systems and the new external realities of the modern world. Internally, the very slowness that used to create stability became a fatal hesitation. We have to talk about how the economy began to eat itself, specifically through a mechanism called tax farming, or the iltizam system.
Yes, explain this, because earlier you said tax farming was how they managed the provinces efficiently. Why did it become a poison?
Because the state became desperate for immediate cash. In the early days, a provincial cavalryman was given a piece of land. He collected the taxes, kept some, and in return provided soldiers for the army. It was tied to service.
Okay, that makes sense.
But as warfare changed, as they needed expensive gunpowder infantry instead of cavalry, the state needed cold, hard cash to pay the troops. So they started auctioning off the right to collect taxes to wealthy individuals.
So a wealthy merchant in Istanbul bids on the right to collect taxes in a district in Egypt. He pays the state up front, giving the Sultan the quick cash he needs.
Right. But now that tax farmer has to recoup his investment and make a profit. So he goes to Egypt and squeezes the peasants mercilessly. He takes far more than the traditional tax rate.
Oh, wow. So the peasants suffer.
Exactly. And eventually, the state started granting these tax farms as lifetime leases called malakane. This created a class of incredibly wealthy, entrenched local lords who hoarded wealth, starved a central treasury over the long term, and drove the peasantry into absolute destitution.
A vicious cycle.
The agrarian base, the engine of the empire, was hollowed out by predatory financial practices. The empire wasn't suddenly militarily weak, it was structurally bankrupt.
And externally, while the Ottoman economy is cannibalizing itself, the world is hitting the fast-forward button.
Exactly. The Great Divergence happens. Western European powers industrialized. Industrialization changed the fundamental math of global power.
It wasn't just better guns.
No, it didn't just mean stronger mass-produced rifles and artillery. It meant faster communication via the telegraph. It meant steamships that could project power rapidly across the globe. It meant the creation of massive, industrialized, capitalist economies that could produce cheap goods and flood the global market.
It's the ultimate business disruption analogy. Think of a massive legacy tech company like a Blockbuster or Kodak. In the year 1600 or the 1990s, for those companies, their systems were perfect. They had the distribution networks, they had the massive revenue streams, they managed their ecosystems brilliantly.
Right.
Blockbuster had a store on every corner, just like the Ottomans had a tax collector in every village. But then the underlying technology of the world fundamentally changes. Broadband internet and digital streaming arrive, or in the Ottoman case, industrialization and mass manufacturing arrive.
They can't adapt.
And the legacy company is just too big, too layered, and too culturally set in its ways to pivot. They try to reform, like Suleiman III or Mahmud II tried, but the world is just moving too fast.
And as they fell behind economically, they became increasingly dependent. The European powers began to treat the Ottoman Empire as a massive market to exploit. The empire took on staggering amounts of debt from European banks to fund wars and build infrastructure like railways.
And what happens when they can't pay?
When they couldn't pay it back, the European powers essentially established a financial dictatorship over the Ottoman treasury, taking direct control of tax revenues to pay off foreign bondholders. Control shifted quietly, invisibly, through ledgers and interest rates, long before the borders ever collapsed on a map.
But the fatal blow, according to our philosophical notes, wasn't just the economy, and it wasn't just European cannons. It was an idea, a new piece of political software called nationalism.
Nationalism was the great, unavoidable unraveler of the Ottoman-ranked coexistence. For centuries, people accepted being part of a layered, multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire. Your identity was your religion, your guild, your family.
Right.
But in the 19th century, spawned by the French Revolution, the idea of the nation-state swept the globe. Groups within the empire, the Greeks, the Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Arabs, began to adopt this new software. They started to say, we are not just subjects of a distant sultan. We are nations. We share a language, a history, and we deserve our own sovereign borders.
The Tira framework, the idea of managing difference under an imperial umbrella, completely shattered. The empire wasn't just losing physical land to uprisings, it was losing the very conceptual glue that held its incredible diversity together.
The ultimate breaking point, the final snap of the thinning thread, was World War I. The Ottoman leadership made the fatal decision to ally with the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. It was a massive gamble to try and regain lost territory and break free of European economic strangulation.
And it didn't work out.
They lost the war. And in the crucible of that war, the empire unleashed horrific violence, most notably the Armenian genocide, which represents the ultimate catastrophic collapse of coexistence into absolute systematic destruction. There was simply no way back for the imperial structure.
The empire was officially dissolved in 1922. It was replaced in its Anatolian core by the Republic of Turkey, led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who aggressively forged a secular modern nation-state out of the imperial ruins.
But the rest of the empire, the vast territories of the Middle East and North Africa, did not gain immediate independence. They were fragmented. The victorious European powers, primarily Britain and France, carved the map up into mandates, drawing arbitrary borders that served their own imperial interests, creating a deeply contested, unstable geography that we are still dealing with today.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the story of the Ottoman Empire's collapse is a profound warning. Empires, or any massive human organizations, governments, global corporations, sprawling institutions, rarely fall just because they were inherently evil, or even just because an outside enemy was suddenly stronger.
They fall from within.
Right. They fall when their internal coherence begins to fray. They fall when the systems that made them great become the systems that strangle them. They fall when their deeply entrenched, pragmatic worldview no longer matches the reality of the rapidly changing world they are living in.
They fall when their ability to adapt lags just a little too long.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've explored the Ottoman Empire not just as a sequence of dates, sultans, and naval battles, but as a deep psychological study of large-scale power. We looked at the Tira framework, how profound patience can slowly curdle into an over-toleration of rigid hierarchy.
Yes, we covered a lot.
We learned how ranked coexistence meant that tolerance was not equality, and how connection and state surveillance shared the exact same cup of coffee. We examined the terrifying administrative brilliance of the Hürrem and the relational power of figures like Hürrem Sultan.
We looked at the agents of structure, who scaled both incredible creation and profound harm, and we traced the intricate pragmatic web of global geopolitics and economics that kept the empire alive for 6 centuries before finally unraveling it.
I want you, the person listening to this, to think about the massive systems in your own life right now. The vast corporations you work for, the governments you live under, the social networks you log into every single day to talk to your friends. Think about the people running them. Are they agents of structure? When these modern systems organize our differences, when they build algorithms to understand our behavior, do they also inevitably wound us at scale? Are the architects of our modern world mistaking their careful, data-driven control for moral goodness?
Now, I would offer one final lingering thought to mull over, building on the chaotic aftermath of this massive history. When the Ottoman Empire finally unraveled, the solution the world presented, the great modern answer to the problem of human organization, was the nation-state.
Right, drawing borders.
The idea was that rigid, clearly defined borders based on singular national identities would be the cure for the messy, unequal hierarchies of empire. But look at the map today. Look at the unresolved fractures, the conflicts, and the ongoing trauma across the Middle East, the Balkans, and North Africa.
It's sobering.
This raises a profound, deeply uncomfortable question. Did the modern world actually solve the problem of living together, or did we simply trade the messy, unequal, but functional coexistence of the imperial wisdom onion for the harsh, unyielding, and often violent walls of the modern nation-state?
Back to the murky waters. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.